Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning from Jakarta and good evening from Canada, and a warm welcome to all panelists and participants who are connecting virtually from around the world. Welcome to the 6th Asia CCUS Network Knowledge Sharing Conference, which this time will bring out the topic of direct air capture, the opportunity in Asia. My name is Dian Lutfiana, Research Associate for Energy Research Affairs at the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, ERIA, and it is my great pleasure to become your MC today. With us now, we have representative from Carbon Engineering, Mr. Paul Kennedy, the Vice President of International Business Development, and Mr. Adam Baylin-Stern as Policy and Engagement Lead from the Carbon Engineering. And later, we will have the representative from Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, Mr. Gigih Atmo, Director of Energy Conservation Indonesia. Before continuing to the main agenda, I would like to briefly explain about housekeeping rules. During the presentation, all participants can drop questions in Q&A box on your screen, and we will discuss them during Q&A session after commentary session. Okay, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to invite Mr. Shigeru Kimura, Special Advisor to the President on Energy Affairs ERIA, to giving his welcoming remarks. Mr. Kimura, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Diane, and a very good morning and afternoon, evening to everyone. First of all, I'd like to express my thanks to the audience here for your kind participation to first Asia CCUS Network Knowledge Sharing Conference in 2022 and 2023. And I apologize the holding the past meeting is so lately. And secondly, I'd like to state my gratitude to the variable speaker from the Carbon Engineering Ltd, who are Mr. Kennedy and Mr. Baylin-Stern. Thank you very much for your participation. And also we have the special guest from the Ministry of the Energy and Mineral Resource, Indonesia, Dr. Dadang Kusdiana, DG of the Renewable Energy and Energy Conservation. But he's now is very busy, so that we have the alternate commentator, Mr. Gigih with the Atmo, Director of the Energy Conservation of the MEMR Indonesia. So that I'd like to, again, the, past conference is so late to be held. And today, ASEAN Secretariat is happy to invite the Carbon Engineering Ltd, which is Canadian climate solution companies, for talking about the DAC, direct air capture, which remove CO2 from the atmosphere directly. As you know, the CCS, especially the carbon capture equipment, can be applied to the fossil power plant and industrial factories which emit CO2 intensively, such as coal and gas power plant, iron, steel, chemical, cement, and paper pulp, and due to its economic reasons. On the other hand, DAC can be applied to removing CO2 emitted by the transportation, such as the vehicles, residential and commercial sectors, and other industrial sectors. This conference is a good opportunity for us to understand DAC in terms of the current technical and economic situation, and CO2 removable cost, as well as a future perspective from the resource presenters from Canada. Also, this conference hopes to touch upon the ASEAN's view on the DAC through the comment from the Indonesian high-level policy makers, Mr. Gigih, and also on behalf of the Dr. Dadang. As you know, the after DAC, CO2 will be stored into the underground, like a CCS, or go to carbon recycling. I guess it depends on the carbon price, and also today's speaker is hopefully Mr. Baylin-Stern. It touch upon the how to after DSC, how to treat the CO2, CCS or carbon recycling. Again, thank you very much all the audience for your participation, and hope this conference should share lesson learned of the DSC to all of you. This is my opening remarks, and I back to Diane. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kimura, for your welcoming speech. Next, we will hear an opening remark from Mr. Paul Kennedy, the Vice President of International Business Development of Carbon Engineering. Mr. Kennedy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Diane. Kimura-san, Mr. Gigih, Dr. Han, Diane, and esteemed participants, good morning, and thank you for attending today's session and for sharing your time and thoughtful questions with us on the important topic of the opportunity for direct air capture in Asia. My colleague Adam will provide an overview of the place for direct air capture, or DAC, or DAC, as we'll talk about in the presentation, in the world's path to net zero in 2050. And he'll talk about carbon engineering's approach to DAC at climate relevant scales to help meet our global climate goals. As I've traveled around and met with many groups in Asia talking about DAC and the role of durable carbon removals in decarbonizing hard to abate emissions and achieving carbon neutrality, there are four key things that keep coming up in those discussions. The first one, which I think is really important and relates to the room that we're all in today, together, is that Asia has a strong history of working together to solve challenges that face the region, whether they're economic challenges, environmental challenges, all sorts of things. And the Asian CCUS Network and this event are great examples of that cooperation and collaboration. The region needs a full range. The second thing is that the region needs a full range of decarbonization solutions, and regional cooperation can help ensure that those solutions are implemented where they're the most beneficial and the most cost effective. One of the things Adam will talk about is how direct air capture can be placed almost anywhere because it doesn't require to be close to an emission source. You can put it where it makes the most sense. Several countries, the third thing that keeps coming up as I talk to people is that several countries in the region have tremendous resources to support the implementation of DAC projects. Great reservoirs for sequestration, existing infrastructure for the transport and storage of liquids and gases, which is really important. And maybe almost most important of all, a trained engineering and operations workforce that understands how to build and operate large industrial infrastructure. And fourth, it's really about leveraging those resources that the countries have and bringing international investment to climate change solutions. And it presents a remarkable opportunity for economic development, jobs, and a positive impact on the communities and the environment as part of a just transition. Carbon engineering, as Adam will tell you in a moment, is in the commercialization phase of large-scale direct air capture and can help our forward-thinking partners realize the benefits of durable carbon removal at climate-relevant scale. I hope you enjoy the session. I look forward to hearing your questions, and I'll pass it back to Diane and to Adam. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy, for your opening remarks. So in proceeding to the next session, we will have a presentation from Carbon Engineering to discuss about the opportunity of direct air capture in Asia by Mr. Adam Baylin-Stern, Policy and Engagement Lead. Excuse me. And I'm now inviting Dr. Han Fu-min, Senior Energy Economist, ERIA, as our moderator for this session. I'll pass this session to Dr. Fu-min. Please, Dr. Fu-min, the floor is yours.
Very good morning. Diane, do you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Thank you so much, by the way. And our special talk today on this direct air capture, as introduced by Diane already, is Mr. Adam Baylin-Stern. He is a policy and engagement lead from the carbon engineering company. I think today it's very exciting, as already highlighted by both Kimura Sensei and also by Paul Kennedy. This is direct air capture, one of the promising technology that can be upscaled very fast because of the a strong demand that we can predict in the now and in the near future. To understand more about this, I think it's a good opportunity to hear directly from Adam, who is currently working on this issue. Adam, if without further ado, I give the floor to you. Please take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Han, and hello to everybody from Vancouver, BC in Canada. So I'll share my slides in just a moment, but just to reiterate our thanks again for this opportunity to be part of this Asia CCUS Network event today. We think that it's a hugely valuable organization to promote carbon capture and related technologies within the region and to allow governments and industry to collaborate. So yeah, very happy to be here. Thanks again, Ms. Dian, Kimura-san, Mr. Gigih, and of course, everybody that has tuned in virtually for this event. So I will just share my screen. And I believe it is now visible, yes? So today the topic, direct air capture and the opportunity in Asia. If there's one thing, I have a little overview of what I'm gonna be talking about during my presentation today. And I think if there's really one thing that I would like you to take away from today is that direct air capture as a technology that enables carbon removal is something that is not simply an added cost, but rather it can be a valuable economic opportunity. And I'll come back to that theme throughout the presentation. But just to begin with, I'll give a bit more in terms of the context for the technology and talk a little bit about the opportunities. So to start with, I think, and to set the scene, it's useful to think about our remaining carbon budget. When we start to think about the urgency of the energy transition and how important and difficult it is in terms of achieving carbon neutrality and getting to net zero emissions, we can look at this idea of if we were to continue emitting carbon at the rate that we have globally, we would have fewer than 7.5 years left on the carbon clock before we get to a point where temperature rise hits the 1.5 degree level. And shown here, we can see that, of course, emissions keep rising, adding about 2 parts per million per year. And that even if we were to do absolutely all that we could to get to avoid emissions, to reduce all sources and eliminate as many sources of emissions as we possibly could today, we would still have a need to remove on the order of 1 trillion tons of CO2 to return to safe atmospheric CO2 concentrations. So this really highlights that we need to do both carbon reduction as well as carbon removal in order to achieve net zero, which inherently means a balance between any residual emissions and carbon removal from the atmosphere. Another kind of important scene setting that I'd like to do is really to highlight how important it is to distinguish carbon removal from carbon avoidance. So again, absolutely critical that we reduce emissions from all across the economy to the greatest extent possible, and then that we complement this with carbon removal, and the scale of carbon removal that will be necessary means that we need to be doing both already today. Shown on this slide is a graphic that shows that avoiding 1 ton of CO2 emissions elsewhere in the economy still means that there are whatever emissions are taking place today. So really getting to net zero is all about balancing any residual emissions that exist in the economy with long duration carbon removal. And direct air capture is one approach for high integrity carbon removal. So before I get into the technology itself, just want to give a bit of background on the company Carbon Engineering, where I work, and some of our facilities. So Carbon Engineering as a company has been pioneering large-scale direct air capture since 2009. The company started as research by Professor David Keith, and since then has moved to an area near Vancouver in British Columbia, a town called Squamish, and has grown as a company after both operating a pilot project in Squamish since 2015, and then completing our innovation center, which is what's shown both behind me in the image here, as well as on the slide, which is a larger scale research and development facility that serves to optimize and de-risk technology that can then be inserted into commercial facilities worldwide. So here it is, the Carbon Engineering Innovation Center. A little bit more background on our company. We have a range of investors. One of our early investors was Bill Gates, and we've also formulated a global deployment partnership with the company 1.5, which is a subsidiary of Occidental's Low Carbon Ventures company. So together, we are global deployment partners, and our business model is to work together alongside a local territory development partner on establishing facilities in jurisdictions around the world. So a little bit about the technology itself. At its simplest, direct air capture is a technology that allows us to capture CO2 in ambient air, in the air around us globally, which is roughly at an even concentration anywhere in the world, and capture this CO2, which is very dilute, around 0.06% CO2 by weight in the atmosphere. So what we do is we have large industrial cooling towers. These are essentially huge fans like you would find on large buildings, where they serve the purpose of cooling. And instead, using these along with a basic solution of potassium hydroxide to process large amounts of air and then selectively bind the CO2 into this liquid medium. The CO2 that's captured in this process is then purified through a series of two different chemical cycles, ultimately into a form calcium carbonate, where under high temperature heat, the CO2 is released and purified and compressed, and then can be either stored or used similar to CCS applications. So one of the kind of design features of our technology is that it's based on existing industrial equipment that has an industrial precedent. So it's really a configuration of different pieces of industrial equipment that are already used in different sectors of the economy today. And for this reason, we believe that it's got the ability to deploy globally, given that supply chains already exist for much of this equipment. And as well, worth highlighting that this technology is really designed to operate at megaton scale. So everything about the technology is optimized to give the best, most cost-effective performance when done at a large scale. And this is, of course, given the reason that we're doing it is to have a meaningful impact on climate change. So we design everything to work best at climate relevant scale. So I'll now move on to, as I alluded to earlier, the kind of two main use cases that we have for direct air capture. So on the left here is a depiction of carbon dioxide removal, CDR as it's often referred to. The carbon removal use case pairs direct air capture of CO2 from the atmosphere with geologic storage. Again, this is similar to what you do with CO2 captured from point sources, but as opposed to allowing the avoidance of CO2 emissions from, for example, cement or steel or power facilities, this allows the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. The other main use case is shown on the right. This is the low carbon intensity fuels and products use case. And so in this case, we're thinking about taking CO2 from the atmosphere, and largely what we're thinking about is the fuels case, where CO2 can be combined with clean hydrogen and synthesized into different fuels. For example, kerosene or jet fuel, which can then be used in aviation. In terms of our commercial status and where we are at in terms of deploying commercially, this is a bit of a kind of overview of what's underway on the commercial side. So I already mentioned built in 2015, our pilot plant, and then our innovation center built in 2021, both in Squamish. We also, last year, alongside our partner 1.5, started construction of the facility we're referring to as DAC-1. This is a facility that will initially have a capacity of 500,000 tons of CO2 per year removed, with the potential to scale up to 1 megaton per year. This facility is located in Texas, and notable about location, of course, is the US, which has been a leader in terms of carbon capture policy, and just last year saw its tax credit policy, the 45Q tax credit, increased to up to $180 per ton of CO2 removed. So policy like this really strengthens the business case for these kinds of facilities, and is something that has been influencing policy discussions around the world. We also have other plants that are at earlier stages of the engineering cycle. So working with partners also in other jurisdictions that are not shown on this chart. But what's shown here are facilities in UK, Norway, and Canada that are at earlier stages of engineering, but are also large-scale commercial designs. So thinking now to the opportunity in Asia, we really think that Asia is very well positioned to seize opportunities in the net zero transition. And of course, we're a direct air capture company, and we think that a few different areas have the kind of natural and competitive advantages that are needed to unlock CDR and CO2 utilization at very large scale. One of these is excellent storage potential across the region. Here we've shown two different maps showing the storage potential in the Southeast Asia region. One of them is, of course, here on the top from the Asia CCUS Network, showing both in some of the shaded areas, sedimentary basins, oil and gas reservoirs, and saline reservoirs that are suitable for geologic storage of CO2. So also showing some of the point sources, but an excellent way to see the scale of the opportunity that exists in the region. And a similar graphic from the International Energy Agency, who released a report on the opportunity for carbon capture in Southeast Asia, and similarly showing the extent of CO2 storage possibilities. A couple of other important factors when it comes to deploying direct air capture. One of those is the availability of clean energy. Again, exists in the region. The strength of channels to market and customers. And so this is really kind of getting at this concept of regional collaboration and linking different jurisdictions in terms of sequestration and market demand for carbon removal. As Paul alluded to earlier and mentioned in his opening remarks, industrial and labor force capacity. So there's an abundance of highly skilled labor that exists in the region from very relevant sectors. So a lot of the skills in the oil and gas industry are very much applicable in terms of CO2 storage and direct air capture operations. Local supply chains, as mentioned, the design for direct air capture facilities using carbon engineering's technology are based on equipment that is already widely used in different industries, and supportive policies and incentives. So I'll talk a little bit more about supportive policies and incentives, but I think really kind of looking back to the maps that are shown here, we can see regions like Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand that have this vast sequestration potential, which really presents a really important economic opportunity. And then regions that are developing policies, Indonesia, Japan, that are starting to put in place policy platforms that could really generate significant market potential for carbon removal and direct air capture. So moving a little bit now into the policy and market space and talk a bit about what's needed to create the business case to do direct air capture. So on the left of the current slide, we have the Goldman Sachs Carbonomics cost curve. So it's really just showing that the cost of decarbonizing different sectors. And what it's showing is that that they vary widely, and that as you get to the right side of the curve, the costs of decarbonization rise very quickly, and we land in the kind of the part of the curve, the hard to abate industry, hard to abate sector part of the decarbonization cost curve. And on the right, we're zooming in on both power industry, in which we see relatively lower cost opportunities for decarbonization, and then looking at some of the hard to abate sectors, the ones that are shown in dark blue are different parts of the transportation sector. And transportation sector has some of the hardest to abate emissions, long haul trucking, for example, and aviation, which is really one of the hardest to abate sectors. And I'll talk more about that soon. But what we're seeing in this kind of zoomed in portion on the right is that already today, the policies that exist around transportation are generating price signals on the order of hundreds of US dollars per ton of carbon. And so this is really kind of showing that policies in the transportation sector, things like existing low carbon fuel standards and greenhouse gas based systems are already providing price signals that could really be a strong element of the business case to do direct air capture. And just to point one policy out, the California low carbon fuel standard is an interesting policy because it includes a very specific CCS protocol. And within the CCS protocol, direct air capture projects can also generate credits within that fuel emissions reduction market. So, as mentioned, aviation, there's quite a bit going on here, but really this is to show that there are large compliance markets coming. So the aviation sector is amongst the hardest to decarbonize. The infrastructure itself, we're just reading an article about how long-lived the infrastructure in the aviation sector is, and in particular, jet planes are designed to operate for decades, and production capacity is limited, while substitutes to really different powertrains are also quite limited. So, so what's shown in the graph is really in the light gray shaded area is an imminent policy that the International Civil Aviation Organization, through their carbon offsetting program for aviation, which is going to be a policy that comes into force later this decade, is going to generate a very high kind of demand for emissions reduction, so a very large compliance market. And what are the options for international aviation to decarbonize? Well, to do it directly, you can change fuels, and this is where sustainable aviation fuel can come into play. And things like biofuels to generate sustainable aviation fuel have a very big role to play. But there are also some inherent limits to the extent that those fuels can be produced. And increasingly, we're seeing the aviation sector pay a lot of attention to using carbon removal based on direct air capture as a way to comply with these imminent regulations in the aviation sector. So, for example, Airbus, who the airplane manufacturer, in fact, pre-purchased 400,000 tons of carbon removal from the 1.5 direct air capture facility that I mentioned before. And one of the reasons for this, and one of the drivers for this, is the fact that within this ICAO CORSIA aviation policy, already today, there are pathways that define the use of direct air capture as one of the compliance pathways to meet this regulation. So a little bit more about policies, and I have after this about one more slide before wrapping up. So thinking about kind of what types of policies can be used and how important government support is in terms of establishing a direct air capture industry. Why are they needed? So first off is really valuing the service that direct air capture provides, putting essentially a price on the service that CDR can play within an economy. Second is to create climate investment and viable long-term markets. And then third is really to create jobs and transition opportunities. A couple of examples of the types of policies. First is what we've called market creation policies. These are policies like that California low carbon fuel standard or other low carbon fuel standards that allow direct air capture to sell the environmental attribute that they create in terms of carbon removal into those systems. Also things like direct procurement. We're seeing some initiatives from governments around the world that are looking at directly procuring carbon removal based on direct air capture as a way to support both their own energy transition goals and also to provide an early source of demand for these technologies that are so critical to meeting decarbonization objectives. The second category, financial support policies. So this kind of encapsulates things like this 45Q production tax credit. So it's an output-based subsidy that provides a specific amount per ton of CO2 removed. Project-based support, things like grants for projects and other measures that you can provide capital cost support to projects. And also on the last thing here is market facilitation policies. So here we're talking about the legal and regulatory frameworks for CO2 storage to ensure that there are clear rules around how CO2 is stored and the rights and responsibilities of the different stakeholders. Having capacity targets. So here we can look to regions like the UK that has very specific targets for carbon removal within their transition plans. Other forms of kind of carbon capture targets as well exist in a few different jurisdictions. And then also market linkage. So market linkage, let's go to the next slide because I'll talk about that there. Oh, there we go. So here we're talking about measures to link markets to really enable regional collaboration. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, really essential that regions work together to take advantage of the fact that certain areas have extensive CO2 storage potential, sequestration potential, but that market demand is growing both within international forums and also in high emitting countries. So we think that the Asia CCUS network, when we think about regional collaboration, is really a great example and a hugely valuable network in terms of facilitating these kinds of linkages. And we really think that connecting supply, so sequestration potential, for example, with demand that might be driven by policies in a given country will really unlock the economic opportunity that exists to generate and support a direct air capture industry. Now, what are the tools and different kind of mechanisms that either exist or have been proposed that can allow this kind of climate cooperation? So I just mentioned ICAO CORSIA. This is the aviation policy. There are also under development a few different methodologies and standards that aim to certify removals that provide guidelines on accounting and transparency of different carbon removal approaches, which are critical to really ensuring that life cycle analysis is accurate and really shining a light on what are the durations of carbon removal that can be generated and what are the quality of different options to do carbon removal. Article 6.2, Article 6.4 are mechanisms within the Paris Agreement by the UNFCCC that are explicitly designed to support international carbon markets. So Article 6.2 aimed at allowing country-to-country carbon credit transfers, and Article 6.4, which is a more project-based mechanism, which could, using, for example, methodologies and standards that certify removals, allow the creation of an international market for removals, matching buyers and sellers of these types of credits. And then last, I have Japan's joint crediting mechanism, the JCM, which is, we think, a really excellent example of an Article 6.2 country-to-country mechanism. Of course, has been used for years and successfully used to support projects in decarbonization. And we're starting to see, in fact, at an event just last week, we saw a presentation by Japan's Ministry of Economics, Trade and Industry, Environment, Trade and Industry, announced that there are planned revisions to the JCM rules and guidelines in terms of making carbon capture projects eligible under the JCM. And we think it's a really, really exciting development, a really great news. And we're encouraged to see how the consideration of removals, direct air capture, but really kind of technology-based removals may fit within these planned revisions. And we think that that direct air capture could fit very well within this system. So I think what I want to leave you with, and what I mentioned at the beginning, is really that we think direct air capture is a huge opportunity for both climate objectives and economic development. We think that there's a huge opportunity in the region, and I'll leave you with that for today, but look forward to taking any questions that you might have for Paul and I, and thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Adam, for very informative presentation on these technologies, direct air captures. I think you cover quite very well from the technology side up to the market side, the potential scaling up of the technologies in the futures, as well as on the regulation that need to support this technology in the markets. I think we have our commentators from Indonesia, that Mr. Gigih Atmo. I think he probably very excited with your presentation and detail in your talk, and I think be very relevant in the context of ASEAN here, Southeast Asia. I think let's see his perspective, how he see the direct air captures could be, I think, very very benefiting to this region. Without further ado, Gigih Atmo-san, are you here? Yes, okay. I think he is the Director of Energy Conservation from the Ministry of Energy, Mineral Resource of Indonesia. The floor is yours, please, to make a very nice dialogue and comment with the Adam on this topic, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And hello, Dr. Han Plumin. Long time not to see you. Good to see you again, although it is true online. Thanks to Mr. Adam for your very interesting presentation on how new technology that has been exists quite a while for predominantly in oil and gas industry might also be available to become one of the solutions for climate change mitigations, direct air capture. Very interesting presentation. I have a few quite a few questions to ask. The first is how direct air capture can be part of the solution to under the UN CCC framework, that it's also part of the technology that has been approved or has been, you mentioned that there are certain methodology and standard that has been available to certify the carbon removed from air captures. That's my first question. And my second question will be related to the economic of this technology. How, like if we put in the context of Indonesian market, we introduced a presidential regulation last year on carbon pricings. And then subsequently, we are moving toward the introduction of emission trading scheme. Earlier this year, we will try to trial on the ETS on the coal-fired power plants. I wonder if how would you like to suggest on how this technology there might be a potentially become an offset to context of Indonesia, because during the G20 summit, leader summit last November, we launched what we call it a roadmap of net zero emission Indonesia, whereby we are expecting to reach peak emissions around 2035 and for 2040, with the peak emission around from the energy sector alone will be around 748 million tons of CO2 emission. And then gradually toward 2060, it will be reduced up to 129 million tons of CO2 emissions. Of course, during our modeling work from the demand and supply under net zero emission environment and scenario, we haven't incorporated the technologies such as direct air captures. So this is, I think, for the first time we hear in much more detailed information about this technology, and we are looking forward to learn more about it. And I wonder if there are also opportunity or can explore some potential application such as pilot demonstration projects. And having said that, I would like to, without talking much more, I would like to hear your comment on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak Gigih. I think Adam, please take the floor then, I think.
Thank you, Dr. Han. Thank you very much, Mr. Gigih, for the great questions. And indeed, we were really happy to see a lot of the excellent initiatives last year under the presidency of the G20 in Indonesia, and excellent to see the developments around policy and as you mentioned, pricing systems, as well as carbon capture applications. A lot of exciting developments that we saw from Canada here. So I think for the questions, I'll touch on this point on methodologies, and also talk a little bit about ETS, as you mentioned, kind of ETS and the applicability of policies like this. And then I'll turn it over to Paul to talk a bit more maybe on the cost of the technology, and then also potential applications in Indonesia and elsewhere in the region. So I'll kind of break it down into those 4 pieces, and I'll take the first 2. So the first point here on kind of methodologies and really kind of standards that can allow you to certify, because ultimately when we think about direct air capture as an activity, as an industrial activity, it's generating as an output a service, an environmental benefit as a service. And in order for that service to be reflected and within markets, within voluntary and compliance carbon markets, we think there needs to be very transparent, but also very rigorous standards and guidelines around what are the attributes of the carbon removal. So for what duration is the carbon removed? What are the emissions associated with doing that carbon removal, to ensure that we really have a full life cycle accounting of the emissions benefits, and ultimately to give confidence to both buyers on the voluntary market, to governments who may be supporting either directly or indirectly through policies, but putting resources towards supporting these technologies, to give confidence to those people that are creating the demand that that these emissions reductions, emissions removals are high quality. So there's a few different initiatives that are underway that are developing methodologies related to carbon capture and related to carbon removal. One of the ones is the American Carbon Registry, which currently has a direct air capture to enhanced oil recovery methodology, and a direct air capture to dedicated geologic sequestration methodology that are in the works. There's also initiatives like the CCS Plus initiative, and a few others that are leading in terms of this kind of methodology and standard development space. And then I guess just one other thought is just how important also these are for market linkages, because for removals to become eligible within, for example, this Article 6.4 system, it's really critical that there are transparent, rigorous ways to account for the environmental attributes and the carbon credits that might be traded. The second kind of aspect I'll touch on before handing over to Paul is to your point on emissions trading systems and kind of how can you create the right incentives from government policy for carbon removal. And this is definitely an area of active discussion in places around the world, one being kind of Europe, another even here in Canada. We're talking about an offset system within our carbon pricing system. And really, while a carbon price puts a price on an emitting activity, we're creating a negative emission when we're doing direct air capture and storage. And so allowing those negative emissions to be incentivized within a carbon pricing system is possible, and is one very good way of supporting a market. There are also tools like contracts for difference, which we see under development and under consideration, for example, in the United Kingdom, which can be a complementary policy to a pricing system that could support a very specific or more of a removal technology. So the UK looking at these contracts for difference, which essentially provide a price guarantee to project developers that might be generating emissions reductions, and in which case the price difference between the activity and the carbon price will either be a subsidy, or should the carbon price grow even higher, the project proponent can balance and pay it out. Does that answer the kind of those first 2 points before I turn it over to Paul?
Yes, thanks for that response. So I would like to hear more about that. Maybe Paul can add. But in particular, I'd be glad to hear that there are some development that currently in the US, there is some progress on the development of the methodology, which we would like to expect that it will be aligned with the global UNFCCC methodology, such that when we incorporate this mitigation measure and technology into the framework of a carbon reduction or even during NDC target as part of the technology, or maybe in the long term net zero emission target, that it comply with the international standard. And I'm also glad to know that there are some development in the UK with regard to the contract for difference. We would like to hear more on that issue. Thank you.
Happy to add later. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you, Paul.
And,
if you could you also touch upon the cost perspective as Adam mentioned?
Sure. I like how Adam gives me all the easy questions. I guess I might add just one more thing on the policies side of things. As Adam mentioned, there's the contract for difference approach. The US has taken the production tax credit approach. Canada has implemented, and other countries are considering implementing investment tax credits on the capital expenditures around CCS and direct air capture. It really depends on what works best for the economy and the taxation approach that different governments take. And obviously the work that was done in the Inflation Reduction Act in the US has created a lot of interest and demand for carbon removal, both for CCS and for direct air capture, which is great. When we think about the markets, Mr. Gigih, as you were talking about the potential for an ETS in Indonesia, and there are ETS programs in other countries. One of the things, Adam had a slide that showed a portion of the Goldman Sachs Carbonomics abatement curve, which is, shows us the estimated cost of abating each ton of emissions across the spectrum of the world's gigatons worth of emissions, many gigatons worth of emissions. And in the direct air capture space, we're very much focused on those elements of the abatement curve that have a very high abatement cost with current technology, or have no abatement options at all. So lots of the programs like power systems, electricity systems that are covered under ETS or cap and trade systems are not places where direct air capture would necessarily be a good fit today. You know, as the cost comes down, then maybe we start to intersect with the work that's happening in those places. But there are lots of other abatement approaches that work really well at those lower parts of the cost curve. At the higher end, what we see is we see industries and markets where the current cost of abating each ton of CO2 released is significantly higher than the levelized cost of capture from DAC. And when we talk about the levelized cost of DAC from a carbon engineering perspective, we tend to look, there are really two places, and I've seen some questions in the chat, so I'll try and half answer some of those questions around the emissions associated with the process and that sort of thing. There's a peer-reviewed paper published in Joule in 2018 that covers the carbon engineering process in detail and includes some preliminary life cycle assessment of the emissions, lifetime emissions of the plant and the energetics of performing DAC this way. So I would recommend that people take a look at that. Given all the work that we've done between 2018 and today, the cost information is not necessarily completely up to date. And the other place then that I would point people towards for levelized cost of capture, so that's capital, operating, and financing costs all in, would be to our US partner, 1.5, and they've made some public statements in their investor information around what they see as the cost curve for DAC-based CO2 capture based on all of their work with us and their engineering calculations. And today that looks like somewhere in the range of $350 to $425 a ton is what they've published. And they see it going out to 2030 and 2035, getting down into somewhere in the $100 to $150 a ton range over time as manufacturing kicks in. So one of the important things to remember is if we don't start building plants today, when we get to the need for gigatons of removals out in the 2040s and 2050s, they won't be there, because the whole key to getting costs down and the whole key to getting removals increased is to get the technology out there, get a manufacturing tempo. As Adam said, each of the elements of our system is based on a proven piece of equipment that's used in other industries, but we still need to get into more of a manufacturing mode rather than an engineering and construction mode, as we will be on the first commercial scale plant that's currently in progress. Oh, and I see that Adam's put the Joule paper in the chat for anybody who wants to take a look at it. And for the folks who ask questions about sort of the energetics of it and the life cycle assessment, it's all in the paper. And we try to be very transparent and open about the technology and the life cycle assessment, because we think it's critical that in the removal space, we are very clear on the carbon accounting and we do the carbon math properly, which ties back to the IPCC elements and the international transfers that you were talking about before.
Thank you so much, Paul, for, I think, explaining clearly on these some of regulation that can really benefit on this technology, as well as the future cost perspective on these technologies. It's very exciting. I think to all audience, I think you can also ask direct question to Adam and Paul on these technologies in the chat box. And also you can ask about to Indonesia also if you may have question, what regulation, what thing that this direct air capture can be uptake in the near futures. I think we still continue discussion, but since we have many questions, I think I should go through that. We try to capture as much as possible. I think many of your response have already respond to the question, I believe. on technology side as well as on cost. But I think there are specific questions that I may like to read, and both either Paul or Adam kindly respond. I think the first question from Brian, he asked, does DAC, Direct Air Capture 1, in Texas have any scope 1 or 2 emission? That's the first question. And second question, to Adam particularly, the company Carbon Engineering have planned to implement that technology in Indonesia. I think that will be, I think Pak Gigih might also have to answer those. And other, like from Arthur, he asked, how about the jurisdiction of the country for free air relate to that standard? I think this question likely about maybe because if you're doing the direct air capture, carbon removal from atmosphere, it's just a public good anyway. How the perspective around those, that country also benefit freely from your activity. If one country doing this activity, another will benefit directly anyway from a good air. ECC looking for another absorption liquid. This is more on technology to test this carbon removal of these DAC technologies. This is on technology side. And then we have, I think you already respond of this. What are the current economic or scale now? For example, what the average cost of DAC, I think Paul has covered that. Whether the cost could drive down further below the $100 per US ton, I think this will be very exciting. If I think any estimate in the future could be, please also share, because as Paul mentioned, is the range likely 100, 150. I think in terms of affordability still questionable, but how we can drive down cost further. What the cost per tons for DACs? I think you already captured for those. Carbon reduction is necessary. Have you engaged this technology to countries that have huge industrial company that emit huge carbon? I think you can touch upon this also. I noticed the direct air capture to fuel pathway. No natural gas is needed as the heat sources. So the question is how the CO2 capture will be regenerated from the capture solution, then react with the hydrogen to make fuel, synthetic fuel. I think you already touched on your presentation, but please have to clarify all those points. They are amazed with your presentation and the company doing that engage removing carbon. Have you engaged your company to those countries that are huge industrial companies that emit huge carbon? I think we have many questions. Remaining two, I think I don't want to miss. And capture CO2 directly from air where the CO2 concentration is very low. I think more challenging of that. If we locate that close to power plant and cement plant where CO2 concentration is high, will it more beneficial? I think this is a very good question. That should the location of that where it should be located based on the concentration of CO2. When you remove the carbon at atmosphere, what happened on the collected, I think, collected CO2? Does it go another use of those collected? This is a carbon recycling. I think you already mentioned about this, how to utilize carbon before it's permanently stored. I think this is a very excellent question. And we might not just respond to one. I think based on those, to Adam and Paul and as well as Gigih, please have to answer all those questions in general. To Adam first, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Han, and to all participants for the great questions. I'm going to try to answer a couple of them, and then I'll turn it over to Paul some of the questions as well. One of the questions. So, does Carbon Engineering have plans to implement this technology in Indonesia? And we've definitely had conversations about this, and it's something that we think there's a really great opportunity for direct air capture in Indonesia, given excellent renewables potential, given excellent CO2 storage potential, and some history already of CO2 injection, and also given emerging policies, as well as cooperation already today, for example, with Japan on projects. And so we're starting to see a lot of momentum in the country, and we definitely do think that Indonesia would be one of the very good places to implement these projects. So hopefully, yes, in the future we will be able to. One more question was related to how can countries, given that the atmosphere is shared globally, how can countries feel confident that if they are going to support emissions removals from direct air capture, that essentially they will have the benefit in terms of being able to account for these emissions removals. And so a related question that came as well is all about locating facilities near sources of CO2 emissions. So I'll answer these two questions since they have a bit of overlap. The first part is that it really is critical to have clear guidelines around how emissions are reported at the international level. So the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is the body that is responsible and has this central function in terms of accounting for emissions across countries and essentially generating the global total to understand what countries' contributions are. As far as the current kind of inventory guidelines, already today, carbon capture, CO2 that has been stored has been recorded, for example, by countries like Norway in their submissions on national inventories. We do think that there is a need for increased clarity over direct air capture and where negative emissions related to direct air capture activities and CO2 storage from direct air capture activities should be included within national inventory submissions. However, there's no block today to a country reporting direct air capture in an inventory. It can be done already today, and hopefully there will be even clearer guidance from the IPCC going forward. This is a technology that has gone from relatively unknown to as we said, we're already constructing a very large scale, our partner building a very large scale facility in the United States. So it's gone, to the commercial phase very quickly. And so we hope that international guidelines will reflect this as soon as possible more clearly, but no distinct barrier today. And it really is critical, though, that there is transparency around this to ensure that there is no double counting of these activities. And in fact, it ties to one of the, while this is a challenge and something that we need to be very careful about, it's also one of the most valuable parts of direct air capture is the fact that it can be located anywhere globally. It doesn't need to be located near a point source of emissions because CO2 in the atmosphere is homogeneous, it's diffuse. And in fact, when CO2 is emitted from an industrial source, it very quickly, within hundreds of meters, it balances out completely with atmospheric CO2 concentrations or even shorter distances. So no, there's no need or advantage even to locating direct air capture facilities near point sources in terms of capture efficiency. However, when we think about hubs and clusters and shared infrastructure for CO2 storage, there can be economies of scale, and direct air capture facilities are actually an excellent tenant, if you will, within a hub development, given that they have a very stable output of CO2. And so they can be valuable components of a storage hub. But otherwise, really part of the value is the fact that they are in location independent. I think that I will pass it on to Paul to talk to a few of the other questions that came in.
Sure. Okay. Thanks, Adam. And so, Brian, to your question, thanks. It's a good question. DAC 1 in Texas most certainly does have scope 1 and 2 emissions. We account for that in the carbon removal units that are generated from the plant, and all the calculations around how many units of carbon are actually removed and sequestered. And again, you can see some of those preliminary numbers in the Joule paper where the link is there. And we believe that all of the accounting standards for carbon removal should include a full life cycle assessment, so that everybody has clarity on what's happening. And when Adam talks about the DAC plants being location independent, I think it's important to know that the real driver for us is primarily twofold. One is reducing the carbon footprint of the plant. So we want 100% renewable electricity. We want easy access to sequestration, because building CO2 transportation and storage infrastructure is expensive. So we're much more likely to place these plants where they have good access to renewables, access to inexpensive utilities, and usually that happens to be adjacent to the sequestration locations. And that goes back to Adam's reference to hubs. We see the hub developments happening in Southeast Asia in particular. We think there's some great opportunities there. But the two biggest factors for where we put plants are costs, to try and drive the cost as low as possible from both inputs and construction. And then the second is the lowest possible carbon footprint. So we need a bunch of renewables, and we're very focused on that LCA. The other question, Newman Mirza's question around looking at other absorption liquids, we have a very active pipeline of advanced development activity. One of the reasons why we have the Innovation Center that you can see behind Adam and behind myself is because we're always, it runs in what we call a run, rebuild, run mode, where we're testing innovations. We have lab scale, bench scale, and then pilot scale opportunities all within that one facility. And anybody who's been to see our Innovation Center, and we've had lots of people come through, they can tell you that the first thing I tell them when they come to visit is, I can't tell you if it's going to be running today, and I can't tell you exactly what it's going to look like, because we're really focused on cost down innovations, and the team's working very hard. So we've got a big pipeline of advanced development activities, and every part of the plant is available for improvement, including the liquids. And I think we answered most of the. Oh, so for HIU, for your question, direct air capture to fuels pathways, it does use the standard DAC protocol, like the standard DAC methodology for freeing the CO2. So it does actually have a heat source there. It's the same as if you were going to sequestration. It's just that the CO2 stream goes into the fuel synthesis plant instead of into sequestration. And I think that was the bulk of the questions. Well, Dr. Han, I think you're muted.
Thank you both Adam and Paul for responding to most of questions. But there's also one more or two more questions is coming from the countries I don't want to miss. I think particularly from Thailand, they ask, this is a great presentation and also they like the technology you present. But how these direct air capture technologies can be put into government policies? This is a big question. I think it's a new thing that I think not only Thailand, perhaps many for this region, they are still wonder how this can be integrated into government policy to support that. I think it's a good opportunity from Canada, from US, where you benefit from the tax code Q45, and how you expect this region to use what type of policy can be integrated to ensure that this dark technology can happen in the region. Maybe go to Paul first and go to Adam, as well as to Gigih, Sam.
Great, thanks very much. So from my perspective, I think governments can take a step-by-step approach to integrating DAC into their policies. And I think Adam's slide about policy had a nice list of sort of 3 types of policy. And I think for me, the very first thing, especially if you're a country like Thailand that has quite a bit of sequestration potential and could be what we would call a supply country of DAC services, is to make sure that that pore space is regulated so that you have reservoir regulations and some of the fundamentals around how to use that pore space for CO2 management. And then to make sure that as your climate policies and carbon policies come online, that they include direct air capture as one of the possible technologies, or they include air as a feedstock, for example, when you get to synthetic fuels, just making sure that you consider direct air capture and carbon removal as you create those carbon policies. And then the third one is, in my mind, is as you're connecting with other countries on either bilateral or multilateral agreements, try and understand how direct air capture in your country could potentially benefit another economy, and how do you include that in trade agreements, in climate agreements. But it's a step-by-step process. So first, make sure that the regulation is there so that CCS and direct air capture can be done safely and under the existing set of laws and regulations. Then there's a bunch of market policy, and then there's a bunch of international relationships. And now I'll let the actual policy guy talk about it, but I thought I would at least take a shot at it.
No, thank you. No, Paul, I think you really did a great job. I think the underlying kind of policy environment, as you mentioned, is critical as a kind of first step. Regulations around the subsurface, which in a lot of countries that have already fossil oil and gas production, there may already be the elements of legal and regulatory frameworks in place. Thinking then about both market creation, and here's where what Paul mentioned in terms of kind of step-by-step approach, there's often combinations of kind of demand support policies or markets that can really create an industry. And so here we might think of an industrial policy in the form of a tax credit, something that supports capital or operating costs, but which doesn't claim emissions reduction. It's really an industrial support. Maybe this can be combined with access to a market. And so there's everything from voluntary markets, where today we're seeing major interest from companies either in hard to abate interest sectors or even in the financial or high tech space, where there are early movers that want to decarbonize their own organizations with CDR. And so also compliance markets that are emerging in different regions. And then I think maybe the last piece of the pie, and I think this largely really does mirror what Paul said, so I won't take too much more time, is the idea of linking markets. So once you have demand signals that exist in different jurisdictions, the ability to link those demand signals with regions that can do this activity in a cost-effective way is how you can really support the industry, I think.
Thank you.
That's
Thank
a great
you
question.
so much, Adam. But Gigih, do you have any idea to respond to Thailand? I think similar context of Indonesia. How you going to, you probably Indonesia. I think there's a question said, what happened if Indonesian use only $2 carbon price, and it compared to the dark technology which require a certain carbon price to make the technology upscale and support the technology. And what the perspective of Indonesia about that?
All right, thank you, Dr. Han. So in response to that question, a colleague from Thailand, so we would like to put this DAC or direct air capture as part of the solution for the country measure or of the regional measure to achieve the target of NDC. That's the first milestone that we are talking about 2030, and beyond 2030, when collectively the region will also aiming for net zero emissions. So having said that, so one of the key measures is the introduction of a carbon pricing policy. So as we learned from today's presentation, is DAC currently pricing is, the economy is around well above what still challenging. I identify that still above 350 and 500 dollar per ton CO2. So maybe we have to find out the market where it is otherwise hard to decarbonize if there are no technology like such as DAC. If come back to Indonesia, so like we for carbon in the power market, in our net zero emission strategy is we relying heavily on the introduction of or optimizing our renewable energy resources, as well as grid integration to decarbonize the power sectors. And in parallel, we also, maybe you all already aware that during the G20 summit, there are international initiatives like JET-P, that's Energy Transition Partnership, whereby we're trying to accelerate the retirement of our coal fleets or power plant. So in the power sector, in Indonesia, it is quite clear that the pathway, the roadmap to net zero emission or sector decarbonization is through renewable energy and grid integrations. So, but there are still remaining opportunities, in particular in our industrial sector. This is the sector that so far is still very hard to decarbonize. There are opportunities to introduce technology like DAC to capture the emission from the industrial sectors, in particular heavy industries. That might be there are like cement and iron and steel. There might be potential offset from CO2 emission through this DAC. However, we also would like to there are maybe potential to explore there. So when there are good question and good response as well, that it doesn't necessarily located under the point source of emissions. But having said that, maybe you would like to also to think that if we put it under the industrial complex or area, there might be some potential co-benefit, like removing as well the air pollution, local air pollution, in order in addition to capturing the CO2 emissions. Of course, it will rely on the availability of transport mechanism for CO2 capture and the geological storage to store permanently underground. So maybe that will need to be accounted in the life cycle assessment analysis that has been explained by Dr. Paul, that hopefully by combining these two approaches, trade-off between close to the point source of emission and point source of maybe availability of energy resources from renewable, that's also will make a balance where the optimum solution to add. So that's my response. Maybe it's a bit broad, but that's I'm trying to respond to that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Gigih, for your very nice comment and your insight on this perspective. I think we are running to the end of our dialogue and conversation with, I think, with the expert from Indonesia and also expert around the world that joined this discussion. I think we're coming to the end of this panel session. And of course, I think this is, we will have another opportunity to share the insight on that, because it seems that there still be a little bit confusion among, I think, our audience with the DAC technology and CCS, how they are different. I think they are different because DAC is the important technology that remove carbon from atmosphere directly, compared to CCS, which is capture the emission from point sources. So I think that market very strong because emission in the atmosphere already high. So you need to remove that whether by forest plantation or by this artificial carbon removal of that. So I think that is very promising technologies as we are moving toward 2050, that become necessary to meet the 1.5 degrees target of the climate action. So I think we need to come back to talk more on this, and I think it's very exciting. But because of the time, I have to close this session, and I would like to thank the panelists, particularly Adam, Paul, and Pak Gigih, for your excellent contribution for this session. And also thank Kimura Sensei for the beginning of the overview of your talk. It's very excellent. The first time we touch on this technology, we'll come back again. So Dian, because of time, can I give back the floor to you? Thank you so much, by the way, for all excellent talk. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Fumin. Thank you, Mr. Baylin-Stern, Mr. Kennedy, and Mr. Gigih, and all participants for a very insightful presentation and discussion. We have heard from the expert today on how direct air capture or DAC technology could be an opportunity to achieve the net zero target. Now, before we end the conversation, I now call again Dr. Fumin to say a few words for closing remarks. Yes, Dr. Fumin, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Dian. I think we have an excellent talk today throughout this webinar conference. Ladies and gentlemen, I first and foremost, and on behalf of the Asia CCUS Network, we are very thankful to the Carbon Engineering Company for providing resource person to share update technology of DAC and activity of carbon engineering business model that can be scalable to help removing emission, which already in the atmosphere. Also thank the Pak Gigih from the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources of Indonesia for your insight and comment on the presentation. The IPCC assessment report on mitigation climate change has already stated that the direct removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is now unavoidable. In order to reach our climate target, we must both reduce emission at source as well as remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at large scale. The agency of examining the artificial carbon sink technology such as DAC, also CCUS, to reduce global emission is necessary and have broad and enormous approach that this could help countries with large dependency on fossil fuel to make more meaningful of just energy transition, to protect social well-being through energy affordability and security, while at the same time protecting the global warming simultaneously. So we need to ensure that the technologies such as DAC CCUS are an affordable technology in the near future. Therefore, we need to take stock of the current development of DAC and CCUS cutting-edge technology innovation, various policy instruments, private involvement, and government support to ensure that the technology will be scalable, affordable, and cost competitive in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, what we heard today is very exciting that DAC is one of the promising technologies. It can get momentum to be expanded in large scale in response to rising climate ambition. Thus, developing the right policy incentive, the DAC technology will be a game changer in removing emission from the atmosphere. The capacity building and knowledge sharing, such as today event on DAC and CCUS, are so critical to have policymakers to understand the element of suite of carbon sink and carbon removal technology and require policy that are best fit into each country's circumstance. The speed and adoption of DAC and CCUS technology to address global climate goals will require fast learning through capacity building, effective policy, including putting in place clear and supportive legal and regulatory framework, creating business model, and facilitating CO2 infrastructure investment. Ladies and gentlemen, last but not least, I would like to take this opportunity to tremendously thank the company Carbon Engineering again, Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, Indonesia, ERIA MITI for their support in this event. Let me once again thank all participants who joined this important conference, and I wish a wonderful day. Thank you, and back to you, Dian.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fumin, for your closing remarks. And now we have come to the end of the conference. Thank you to everyone participating in this virtual conference. We are very honored to have our speakers sharing their view and expertise with us. Please visit our website at www.asiaccusnetwork.org to receive all about ASEAN news and updates and upcoming events. We are looking forward to seeing you in the upcoming knowledge sharing conference and next ASEAN activities. With that, this conference is officially closed. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Thank you.
Dian, thank you so much. Yes.
Thank you, Pa. Thank you. See you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.